Welcome back to the PolicyViz podcast. I'm your host, John Schwabish. Hope you're having a good start to the year. I hope you enjoyed the last few episodes of the show. We've been dealing with some interesting pieces on different data visualization books. And today's actually going to be no different because on this week's episode of the show, I am fortunate enough to be chatting with Lilach Manhein-Lorio, who I've been chatting with a lot lately because I've been thinking more about how we as a field critique data visualizations and the different types of ways that we critique data visualizations. And so Lilach and I have been emailing back and forth. She's been so kind and generous to take a lot of time reading through this very long post that I'm publishing today, along with this podcast episode about the field of data viz critique. And Lilach has a book coming out later in the year about this concept of critique. How do we do it? How can we do it better, both as a critic and as someone receiving criticism? And how can we do that not just as individuals, but also how can we do that within teams and within organizations? And so what you're going to hear in today's conversation is the start of Lilach's work on this at Visa, where she and her team created this data experiences framework. It's like 10 pages long. It's terrific. It gives you some, I would say not some, a lot of ways to think about generating critique and to think about all the different aspects of a data visualization that you might want to think about and talk about and try to improve upon. And I'll link to that in the show notes. There's a lot of books that we talk about here as well, not just in data visualization, but also in the UX, UI fields. So I link to those as well. So I'd really encourage you to listen to today's conversation. I'd encourage you to check out the blog post that I'm publishing along with today's conversation about my sort of view on data viz critique and what we as a field need to do and what we need to do better and how we need to focus where I think we need to focus our attention rather than just saying, oh, this graph is garbage, this graph is great, what we need to do sort of to move the field forward. So I hope you'll listen to today's conversation, hope you'll check that out, hope you'll check out all the other resources on policyviz.com, on my YouTube channel, my Twitter feed, my Winnow feed, wherever you like to connect with me. And if you have comments or questions, please let me know. You can connect with me at all those different places. So here is today's conversation of the PolicyViz podcast with Lilach Manhein-Lorio. Hi, Lilach. Good afternoon. Welcome to the show.
Thanks so much for having me.
I mean, this is really exciting because so for those who, I mean, no one really knows, say for us, but like we have been emailing at length for like a while about a lot of different topics, primarily what we're going to talk about today. So like, this is very nice to actually like see your face and chat in person.
Definitely. Yeah. And definitely thank you for your patience and openness to my like diatribes on
No, it was great. I mean, this is the thing that is, I mean, I don't know. I mean, I think everybody has their own fears of feedback and rejection and criticism. And something like you have, for me, it's always been writing. Like, that's always the thing. It's like, you know, you just have to learn to like embrace the feedback and the critique. And that's the only way to get better. And that, of course, is a great segue to what we're going to talk about today. Because you are working on a book on critique and feedback, which I'm really excited to talk about. But you've already done a bunch of that work, and I'm sure at least some of the listeners to the show are familiar with the data experiences. It's not really a checklist per se.
We call it a critique framework.
A critique framework, from you and Frank Olavsky and a couple of others, I think. So I'd like to talk about that. And talk about the book and how exciting that is that's coming out. So maybe we can just start. You can talk, just sort of give a little background and how you ended up at Visa and what you do there on the data viz side.
Sure. So I think I'm one of those like got into data viz through a bit of a unique pathway. So initially studied art history. And then a few years later, did my master's in library and information science with a focus on information-seeking behavior, which is really like a fancy, I guess, library term way of saying it's how people, when you have something to research, how do you go about looking for information? And then I really actually heavily got into, while I was doing that degree, kind of how people deal with information overload, and how you kind of interact with a lot of information and decide when you've found enough information to answer your question or complete your task. And so during kind of the last year of my program, I kind of a little bit accidentally discovered dataviz and Tableau. And it was like, the light from the heaven. Like, it was just such a crazy like mashup of everything that I loved and kind of learned or had been doing before that. I never really anticipated using anything I learned in my art history degree and outside a museum. But I definitely, I love how I can bring all of those things into dataviz. So spent a few years kind of building dashboards and doing the BI thing. And I think just as I got further into it, and especially getting more involved in the Tableau community, I really started falling more in love with the teaching piece and like how can I like enable others to improve especially the design piece of the skill set. And so the opportunity opened up. I'd say it definitely a big part of it was the Tableau community, because otherwise I would have known Chris DiMartini, who's running that group. But it was a really good opportunity to work in a center of excellence, which is kind of like more the enabling piece. And the thing that really, really appealed to me, especially about the Visa team, is that we like to call it a small but mighty team. But we're really, I think, partly because of the size of the team, but also kind of like, the nature of working in a somewhat big company. We're really focused on just kind of like tool agnostic data visualization. So, I think that's just a super interesting challenge, a chance to be creative a little, not just in making dataviz, but like, how do you kind of abstract out a little, but not too much? Like, what makes something a good data experience, a good data visualization? And really like helping people, because it's not just tools, right? It's like, it's even like the difference between, BI folks who are making dashboards for other people to, do interactive analysis, or like someone like a data scientist, like presenting results of an analysis. These are very different types of like things that we're making, experiences that we're making.
And I assume both like internal, like data scientists internal to Visa, but also like communicating with banks and customers and the external piece too. Visa does a fair amount of like data products that are kind of sold to customers, like banks. I think you can kind of get a little sense of that. There's a program that I think there's some like information on the developer Visa external website. It's called VAP. I think I should know what that stands for. Visa Analytics Product. But also we have our the VCC, which is Visa Chart Components, fairly recently put out their open source. So definitely, I think because we have some like a fair amount of the data products that are made are for kind of beyond just internal use. We kind of have we maybe have a bit more of the opportunity to do something like open source the charts library. That's great. So I guess we can start with the data experiences framework. So I want to start with where or why that came about. Like, this is like a 10-page framework of doing a better job of providing feedback for all these different, all these different types of visualizations that you just mentioned across, I don't know how many it is. I want to say like 20 different domains. So I'm curious, like, was that sort of demand driven? within Visa, or was it supply driven where like you and Chris and people on the team were like, we definitely need to do this better. Let's create this experiences or this framework.
Yeah, that's a good question. So I think it is somewhat demand driven, and then that we kind of got asked, like within our org, like how can we improve the maturity of data products, and obviously that's part of our team's mission.
Sure.
But how can we measure whether a dashboard is good or not so good, and kind of how can we have some consistency in like saying these are the things that should be addressed to like improve the quality of the experience. But the great thing was that we got a lot of flexibility in terms of like how to do that. And I think especially because of our focus on being tool agnostic, that was kind of like one of the challenges of like, what are things that are universal, right?
Yeah.
But still specific enough that like it can actually help a person to improve visualization.
Right.
And then I think the other thing is that like we really I think Visa generally has a pretty high level of maturity, at least compared to most companies for like the design maturity. So we have a whole team for the design system and also like accessibility. So there's already like people are already used to doing a pretty thorough like accessibility check, like for any product, not just product. And so we wanted to see how we can kind of like infuse more of like human-centered design. So how can we, I think generally because we're data people, right? We think about the data. So when we design, we're thinking about like how can we best present this data rather than like what does a human need to do with the data first, and then what information can we give them to do that. And I think similar with critique, a lot of times we focus on like the things in the data visualization, right? Like did you have a good title, or did you pick the right chart? So these are all like very system focused. In our case, the system is also data, so very data focused. So we really wanted to do something that was, instead of a checklist of going through like, these are, did you do this and this and this? Or like being able to like look at a dashboard or a dataviz and saying, is it like accomplishing these things,
these goals?
And so it was great because I was like, oh, I wonder if we could like take some of the concepts from heuristic evaluations, which are very well established in the UX field, but like apply them more to a data product. And this is where I really love this is where like our team is awesome, because Chris was like, okay, what would it look like? Just run with it. And so I looked at some of the kind of UX usability heuristics. And then there's also been like I'll say a good amount of work on how to apply some of those heuristics to dashboards. Some of them are like very domain focused, like the one that I looked at that I cite in the framework is like I think it had to do specifically with the domain of like health information in a hospital setting. But still, it's a good foundation to extract from. So we kind of took that as a starting point and thought about, kind of did a lot of kind of mapping, very information architecture kind of brainstorming work. I'd like, okay, if you take something like visibility of system status is one where you want to like have filters or like really anything that a user interacts with, like to be to like for users to not have to work to find that.
Right. So filter
obviously
or drop down or
yeah. So so for dataviz, obviously it's a little like there's some unique things that applies to. So that could apply to like, do you have legends that are easy to find or something like that? So it's a process of kind of like coming up with like, what would some questions be specific to a dataviz that would test for that heuristic? And then expanding on that to like what's maybe some additional heuristics that aren't yet, because we want to go beyond just usability.
Right.
So, one that I know we added was, it kind of has a somewhat similar, not necessarily heuristic, but more principle in UX of you want something to be useful. So usable is important, obviously, but useful as well. And so we basically called it valuable. But we really tied it to, like the what you learn or what you're able to learn from using a product.
Right.
So like, does it answer the question that, or, what kind of business value does it add to a user if they were to, use the product to answer that question?
So in the like the UI UX field, a heuristic would be a button or a toggle or a switch or a scroll, just examples. But when you think about heuristics applied to dataviz, in addition to those pieces that you might have a filter or a search bar and like a dashboard, but in just any general data visualization, a heuristic you would be defined as all those elements on the chart space itself, the legend, the axis, all those pieces would be a heuristic. And then
kind of. So I think the heuristic is the kind of test. And those elements are what you look at to see if they have achieved that heuristic. So like preventing errors, let's say, that's one of the common ones. So you could look at all the things, whether it's how filters work or a particular, like a label on an option on a filter. So I think what expands is we still could use a lot of those basic kind of overall tests of like, does the content on the page achieve in the the functionality, does it achieve these heuristics, which are kind of like outcome, more like describing what's a good experience. But then you evaluate all the little, and I think that's one of like the challenges, which is kind of, so our critique framework we have a set of heuristics, and then we also have what we call design pillars. So those are really like the things that the actual objects on the page, or it's like what of what you look at when you are critiquing a dataviz. The heuristics are kind of like goals, like principles of what we want to, it's kind of like almost how we describe if it's a good experience. So and I think the somewhat unique thing we did is that the original, like Nielsen's original 10 usability heuristics, we took those, and we had an additional 6. Some were like a little bit invented. Like I added one for limiting distraction, which isn't really, official heuristic anywhere. But what we did is we took those like individual heuristics and we said like, okay, what does, we kind of categorize them into 5 broader categories. And the category is kind of more like an outcome. And I think it helps you. So we call them human-centered heuristics and outcomes to really make the point of like, this is really describing what does a great data experience feel like for a human who's using the product, right? So like if you think of something like efficiency is, something we tend to think a ton about in dataviz. We put that well, we call it productivity. So it's kind of framing it a little bit more.
A little bit differently,
like,
right?
This is what it allows the user to feel or to do. Right. And then that rolls up to the focused and clear category. Mm-hmm. So, if a data experience is focused and clear, it basically allows a user to focus on the most important information, like for completing their analysis. Mm-hmm. So the heuristics are really like describing it in even more detail. Like, what does it mean to be focused and clear? What mm-hmm. it allows you to be like productive. It still provides flexibility is another one. And I think the other couple in there is limiting distraction and directing attention.
It is really interesting the way you describe it, because the change of the word efficiency to productivity, I think, is really smart, because efficiency in a lot of ways sort of implies speed. Like, can I get the point of this graph as fast as possible, as opposed to how does this graph actually help me do my job or make a decision, which is different. That's interesting. I wanted to ask you, and then I want to shift gears and talk about how this launched into the book. But you framed the work on this as sort of tool agnostic. But lots of people are using lots of different tools, and this could be used for any of those. And I'm curious whether you think that approach was limiting or it was freeing, because I can imagine if you're like, let's build this for Tableau, you might in some sense say, well, then you should use this filter type for this type of data and this type of map for this type of data, even though those could be applied to different things. So I'm just curious, like, in retrospect, if someone said, let's make this for Tableau or for Excel or for JavaScript or Python or whatever, would you have been like, oh, okay, like, yeah, that puts me in a fairly simple box, but also like too constraining?
So I think it probably just made the challenge really interesting.
Yeah.
So I would say, I think it did help to move away from, like specific, like thinking about building stuff.
Right.
I mean, I think one thing is, obviously I think through a lot of dataviz stuff is in Tableau terms, because what I'm used to. So like when I think about something like negative space, right?
Yeah.
A lot of times I'll think about it in terms of like, did you add padding to a container?
Yeah.
Granted that I think that can apply to, I mean, there's ways to phrase that for, like CSS.
Oh, sure. Right.
Anything. I mean, any tool will provide a way to create negative space with some sort of feature.
Right. But it does sort of put you a little bit in a box of, am I thinking the way someone who's, like the way we think about it is sort of different when we're in our little tool.
Yeah, totally. I do think, though, that what helped is we do have a pretty, like, at least on our team, and I think definitely in the design org team, like, we follow more of the design process of designing something outside the tool first, right? Sketching, and also then using, a design tool like Figma or something. Right. And I know that's kind of like a little controversial, like, well, like how much work do you want to put into like making a bar, so I guess I think it's a skill to like abstract it out and not get too detailed into like, oh, what's like the realistic data distribution for this bar chart.
I think that's really what the challenge is, right? Like, I don't know what my data look like until I make the chart with the data, and I can go draw what I want it to look like. But then I throw the data on top of it and it doesn't work because I have some huge outlier. And so I need to use a log scale or something, right? But like, I mean, you've very kindly sent me a couple chapters of the book, which is I'm going to use this as a segue to look through. And like, there are a bunch in just the 2 chapters you sent me, there are a bunch of sketches. And I, while it is a little controversial, because I think there's just the data layer, and I think a lot of people, and I put myself in this box, are just like a little, not embarrassed, but shy about like sharing our sketches. Cause like, can't draw, but like, it is such an important part of the process, just to like to your point from earlier, to pull yourself away from the tool, because like, and I'm like a Tableau, not quite a newbie, but like half a step above a newbie. But like, I'll think like, oh, I just made this thing this morning. I was like, I want to make this thing in Tableau. It should be super easy. And it's not, because I don't know how to do it. Right. And so, so I think it's just those different levels and those different steps, which brings us to your book coming out later this year. So, and I'm increasingly thinking about this like new evolution of dataviz books that like go beyond the 101. So we have the Bridget and Vidya book, Functional Aesthetics. We have Jen Christensen's book, Building Science Graphics, and I think your book is going to fit nicely into this new space. So your book is Let's Talk About Data Visualization, and it's really focused on. I don't want to short shrift it, but it is kind of like the more in-depth version of what we've been talking about, this like framework, and it's really like pushing people into a more, I don't know, like a more concrete way to think about critique and feedback. And so before I like ping you with my questions, so people can hear what I was struggling with the blog posts that I'm publishing today along with this post, I just want to ask you to talk a little bit about the book and what you think it's going to provide people with who are, you know, in the dataviz field.
Yeah, definitely. So first, I'll just say thank you for including me in that category. I'm definitely honored that some of those are some of my new favorite books.
Yeah.
And it's exciting to see the field like moving towards that. I think often, you know, like in when I've spoken at a conference, I've noticed a lot of times design gets put into like the intro level stuff.
Yeah.
And it's really not like, I'll give you one book, an example. One of my favorite books is A Primer on Visual Literacy.
Mm-hmm.
And that is, was written actually in the late 70s, I think. And it's still, I've reread it, I think at least 5 times. And every time there's something else I take out of it. And it's a little crazy how applicable it still is.
Yeah.
But it's very much not a beginner book, right? It's foundational, but it's not. I would say the more you learn about design, the more you can go back and reread it and get a lot more out of it.
Right.
But it's nice to see kind of people, more and more people, like books being written on the kind of beyond the basics.
Yes.
But it can still be very foundational.
Right. And I think there's always going to be, I mean, I'll say this as an author of one of those like 101 books, like there'll always be a space for those, because there's always going to be people coming to the field new, right? They're, you know, they haven't really thought about how to make a B-Swarm chart or something like that, right? And so that's sort of a new experience, but they, like all of us, are going to grow and going to make more and more. And like, what is the next steps? And I think one of the other things that we don't see a ton about in the field, maybe aside from Ben Jones's books and maybe Andy Kirk's book, is on teams and organizations and sort of like a larger group, which what I kind of feel like your book is really going to help people with is you're not just a person on your own making stuff and putting it out and you're being done. You are working in a team, maybe for a boss. Well, we all work for a boss. You're working for someone. Even if you're not working for someone, you're a freelancer, like you are working for your audience, right? Or you're working for your client. So there's always more people involved. And I think that's where the literature really quite isn't at now. Yeah.
And so that's kind of my goal with the book. I would say I was very inspired by this book that's more in the general UX field called Discussing Design. And that highlighted some issues in how general UX field was kind of had room to grow in terms of doing critiques better. And so I think that's a good example of the fact that it is a kind of growing pain. You know, I think it was one of the ways the UX has matured as a design field. There's many flavors of UX, obviously. But so I think that one of the main points that they make in that book that I really kind of try to spend some time in my book expanding on what that might look like for dataviz is the idea that we pretty much agree in the design process. If you're following a better design process, you're separating it out, like defining the problem and coming up with solutions for the problem.
Mm-hmm.
And yet, a lot of times when we critique, we just jump right ahead to the solution.
Right. Yeah.
So it takes, I talk about it as like a skill and like muscles that you have to build, because when you're so used to doing it that way, it takes like relearning the habit, right? You can start out by, maybe catching yourself that, oh, what I just said, really, if you, look out for like anything like I suggest, or what if you did it this way, those are all solutions, and that's fine. So I think like starting to learn to kind of step back and say, okay, this is a solution that's coming to my mind that I'm saying.
Right.
What's the problem that I'm trying to solve with it? And then kind of like, learning to just kind of eventually wean yourself to at least talk about the problem first before, like I do. This is something I guess I've kind of adjusted because I think I probably do get to do a lot more critique in my current role than I did in previous roles, at least beyond my own stuff. That like, especially when you're people that are on the beginning of their learning curve, especially in design concepts, you need to give them some solutions. Like, they don't really know how you can help them understand the problem that you're seeing, but like they can't, if you say, maybe the typography hierarchy is unclear, and it could really help your design be much more scannable, and help people find what they need in the page if you improved your visual hierarchy. But like, what does that mean to someone who's never who doesn't know there's like like best practices for like a type ramp, and like the fact that you're probably better off, to get a little bit into detail, you're probably better off like starting out in the middle and then going to kind of the edges of what's going to be the biggest and what's going to be the smallest, and then kind of feeling like that's a very procedural, it's just I don't know where I got taught that, honestly.
Right. You just pick it up along the way, right?
But it makes it so much easier to do something like that, right? So I think it's both, but I do think like that whole so I'm not saying don't ever give someone like this is how you should do it, but just getting more aware of kind of starting out with defining the problems you see. I think also just generally learning to see more when we look. That's another kind of big piece of
and by that you mean like more of the detailed pieces of a visualization.
So I mean, I think some of that is we can take from kind of art history and visual analysis, being able to kind of identify. So let's say you start with identifying what's the focal point, what is your eye most attracted to, and then kind of looking at what are the kind of individual design decisions that are causing, what are the elements on the page that are causing your eye to kind of move in a certain way or be attracted to a certain part. So I mean, I can give an example. I think this is a kind of common example, or I think it's a pretty good like specific application of this. So if you think about the rules that we have that we try to follow, and whenever we see something in the wild, we're like, it doesn't follow this rule. So one, I think fairly old, or it's not old, but a few years old, is the idea of like, how do you decide on the size for a chart? Right. And I believe it was McGill, I think, they came up with a whole measure of the banking to 45 degrees.
Right, the banking. Right.
So that's a very like specific rule. That's really, but if you think about it, that's really like describing a solution, right?
Right.
But a very like rule-based one of like, make sure it, has the 45-degree angle.
Yeah.
And so the problem with that obviously is there's going to be a lot of exceptions.
Yes.
Right. Doesn't work when especially doesn't work when you're working with like a line chart that's pretty flat.
Right. Right.
And so like abstracting out a level from that would be, well, we want to size it in a way that to make sure that it's true to the data and it doesn't distort or make the data look in a way that is not like true to the actual true shape and meaning of the data.
Yeah.
So I think that's definitely a step in the right direction, but because I think it starts you thinking on like, what is like the problem that you're solving?
You're trying to solve,
like,
right?
Like you want to make sure that people aren't having like interpretation errors because it's like a weird shape. But then I think like there's even like further you can like when I think about like how do we see more when we look at it. So you could start thinking about also, and I think this is where it starts coming in that like we can't really look at just one chart. So like one of the big things that I think you need to consider when you're deciding on the size is like what's the relative importance of the particular, like is it the primary chart? Is it a secondary chart? Yeah. And that should really drive your how big you make one chart versus another chart. But then I think this is where my like internal art historian comes in, is I always really try to consider the wider frame. So in a interactive dashboard, I think we can usually assume it's going to be the shape of the page is going to be a product of your screen or whatever screen it was designed for. But you're rarely going to have like a perfectly square page shape, right? Yeah. You either like rectangular or long form. Even if it's long form, you're only looking at it like one screen at a time. Right? So I think a really important thing is, let's say it's your primary chart. Thinking about like what's the shape of the frame, and is the shape so basically aspect ratio. Right? Is the shape of the chart echoing the shape of the frame, or like contrasting to it? So like if you have, speaking in really broad terms, if you have a rectangular shape of the chart and it echoes the rectangular shape of the frame, the page frame, then it's a kind of like static design. Like it's like there's not a lot of movement in the design, right? Yeah. And so that could make sense, but then just kind of like thinking about if you make something, and maybe it's a chart, maybe it's something else. Like if you think about maybe like a menu that's a tall shape that has a kind of vertical, movement. Right. Yeah, like if you have one chart that's very wide, that could lead the eye, left to right. Right. But that could also depend on other, what are the shapes of the other charts in there, and are they like competing with the kind of shape that your main chart is creating against the frame. So things like that, they're just very, like, it's really visual analysis, which
is, but it's also, one of the things that we can talk about this in a second, because I think it leads back to the post that I published today that that you helped me with. I think the other piece of it is recognizing that different creators have different goals, right? When I think about a columnist at the Times or the Post, their goal is to get eyes on the page, right? That's what matters. Whereas someone working inside Visa, or someone who's, providing a memo to whoever their boss, their goals are just different, right? It's not necessarily about, like, you kind of know, right? Like, you are creating something for your colleague at Visa. They're going to read it. The goal isn't to get people to click on it, because the goal is to make a decision, or as you mentioned earlier, right, to increase productivity. as opposed to efficiency, which I've started that on my notes. I just think that's really smart. I mean, there's been for a long time this discussion that sort of ebbs and flows on impact and how do you measure impact and can you even measure impact? And I think the efficiency thing sort of goes hand in hand. I think the other thing that goes hand in hand with that is speed. It's one of the things that I just like, there's this like obsession with, do I get the message of the graph just like as fast as possible, as if that should be a metric. So I guess the way I want to, the sort of next question I want to ask is, when you see people doing critique today, and we'll keep it sort of in the Twitter world, so we'll like public critique, not within teams, but in the public sphere. What do you think is like the thing most people are doing the most wrong? Like, is there a aspect of critique generally that you think people are just like missing the point, or they're critiquing the wrong thing?
So, like, how long do you have? Obviously, I'm writing a book about this because I'm
writing a book about it, right? Yeah.
But I think you did hit on something that's really important. Is there is a big difference between critiquing someone's work and like critiquing work with someone, right? Yeah. And really, the critique that I do on a regular basis at work, and this sometimes I've also done with public work, like with people I collaborated with, is the second, and it's really a conversation, right? Yeah. And so I don't know how much sometimes people make themselves available, and you can ask, kind of clarifying questions, but really, if you're doing the second kind where you get to have the conversation with someone, and that's why I called my book "Let's Talk About Data Visualization." I mean, you should that should always start with just kind of like when we start on developing data visualization, we're trying to discover and ask questions of like what the user needs. It's a bit similar. You're trying to like discover what was the creator's goals and constraints, and really then like really trying to understand what are the choices they made with the current design, kind of how those work or don't work for what they're trying to do. And that's really, you do that before you go into like more of like evaluating like, what you think isn't working, right? Like you have to really seek to understand what it is, what the current design is. I think we probably don't do enough of that. But saying that, I mean, I think there's like room for the other kind of public form where you don't get a chance to maybe talk to the creator, but just kind of recognizing that's a slightly different thing. It's almost like criticism. I don't know if that's what if you think about art history field, like there's critics that go and look at artwork and write up what they think of it. But that's almost like a different goal. Like, right. So like if you're having more of a conversation with someone, your goal is to help them figure out how to improve their data visualization. Or you could be, trying to kind of evaluate your own work, but your goal is to figure out what's not working and how to maybe make it better. Right.
And to help other people do better, right? When they're
I think the one thing that really is a bit of a I'd say a pet peeve, like the thing that I feel like is starting off things a little wrong, is when someone posts all feedback welcome. And I'll be honest, I fall into that. Sometimes I still have to catch myself. But so I think that's one of the things that I really loved about the Discussing Design book. They brought up that really it's a two-way street. So if you're not getting useful feedback, like, if you're the feedback you're getting is all like, you need to make this button bigger or brighter. Some of that might be coming from like you're not asking for the feedback that it's kind of like I'm the person asking for the feedback.
Right.
Now, obviously, critique on Twitter doesn't usually involve
well, there's
someone
that. Yeah, right,
asking
yeah.
for.
So do you have?
You are like
do you
that's that's one I have a whole chapter devoted to. That is like how can you articulate and describe what is the feedback that you're looking for? So what's the feedback you're not looking for?
Right. I don't care about the size of the buttons or the color of the buttons. I know I need to fix that, but like, so do you have? So instead of all feedback welcome, do you have like a good pithy phrase for people to like, this is like the hook, so they could, they have to wait a few months till the book comes out. But like, what is the phrase do you have that phrase in mind for people?
I probably should have a good pithy phrase. I think I
think your point is maybe there isn't a good pithy phrase, because sometimes maybe you do want to know, like, are the buttons in the right spot versus the colors of the line chart, because I can't control that, because this is what our company follows and it's a red line and that can't be changed, but the button is the button in the right spot. So maybe there isn't a phrase, and it's just you need to be more focused in your soliciting.
So and obviously this is tougher to do in Twitter. Like I think what we've done at Visa, and I've seen like something similar in the DVS channel on critique, is we have like a set of like 3 questions that when you come in and ask for critique, you kind of fill out ahead of time to explain to people what type of feedback you're looking for. In the book, I kind of outlined like that there's like 2 main questions that you as a creator should kind of answer to help people understand what is the type of feedback you want. The first is just kind of what's your goals and objectives to whatever level of detail you want to get. Like what is the design trying to achieve? And the second is, what are the elements that you want to have evaluated? So I think it can be helpful to kind of think about it in terms of, I use design layers in the book. So, is it like something to do with the information architecture, or is it the thing that we usually tend to focus on, which is the chart design? So is it the information visualization layer? So I guess, give some tools for describing what parts of the information product you want, like you want to get feedback on. And it may be like a specific part of it, right? Like let's say you want help with the interaction layer. So like a really broad question would be, how well does the interactive features that I have, how well does that support the like analytical flow, or like the questions that I want to enable people to use, right?
Do the buttons make you more productive? Do the buttons make you more productive? Not make you more efficient. Do they make you more productive? Yes.
But or do they give you like interesting, actionable answers? Right. Like a lot of times, the classic example is having a million filters. They don't really help you come to new answers. But the other one would be like, maybe, do I have clear, do I have clear feedback where like it's clear that when you interact with some feature, it's clear what happened. Right. So that's like a more specific one. Or even like, is this button difficult to find? Right.
Are the outcomes obvious? Is what I have to do obvious? So that's a good. So I think in the short term, before the book comes out, and you have all these checklists. By the way, everybody, for those of you listening, watching, like the checklists, I don't want to call them checklists because they're not really checklists. They are frameworks, and they are cues, are amazing. They're going to be super helpful to you. So be ready. But I think there's a good, in the meantime, till the book comes out, a good lesson for folks to keep in mind. Like when you are asking for feedback, be specific and be purposeful so that you can, get the feedback that you want. And because we've already been talking for an hour, I want to wrap up. But I think also as the critic, to be a little bit more purposeful and thoughtful. And I like this idea of critiquing someone's work versus critiquing with someone are two very different approaches. So, Lilach, thank you so much. I mean, we could keep going, but
let me just add one.
I was gonna say, at some point, people are gonna they're gonna hit 2 times speed. And
I'll just add something because I know this kind of started a big Twitter conversation, but I think I still think it really crystallizes what I guess my book tries to do, and I think what the critique framework also tries to do. It was by, let me see, I wrote it down. It was by Dr. Kat Hicks, and she said, we try to make complex problems easy, rather than making it easier to work on complex problems. So I think if there's any one thing that I think we can push us forward in how we critique, is that we do need to think a little deeper. I think we've done some we have a lot of really great work on very specific rules that kind of cover the easier things. But I totally get the the instinct to want just a rule, like a do and a don't, right? But it really is about how to think a little deeper about all these things. And so I do think there's space for tools. I hope the critique framework is the beginning of that.
For more tools
of that help you to think through some of those deeper things without giving you a set of simple yes no answers.
Right. I mean, I think that's the challenge with the checklist, where there's a box where it's you check a box, check a box, check a box. Because as you said, sometimes they don't apply, and some things I would say are more important than other things. I mean, I don't know, the integrity of the data is more important than the font size of your title, right? But I think I guess if I had to come up with that, it's not a pithy statement per se, but I think the message here is to think more deeply on both sides. I think on both sides is what I'm hearing from you, right? As a critic, to think more deeply about what you are critiquing, and as the person being critiqued or soliciting critique, be more thoughtful about what you want people to say, and maybe how you respond even to those, what I kind of call the hit and run or drive-by critiques, where it's this is garbage. And you're maybe you respond in kind of a different way to be well, I know that you don't like the colors, but that's the branded colors and that's what I use, but is the graph type, is that useful? So I like that. My wife would call it a compliment sandwich. So you give a compliment and then some critique and then another compliment at the end. So the book comes out when, in the fall of this year, summer?
I'm not sure. I think that is
the publishing world of the mystery of publishing world.
Yes.
Right. Okay. But in the meantime, people can find you where? On Twitter, for sure.
They can find me on Twitter.
Right.
I have my regular handle where I will be honest, I tweet about probably politics as much as dataviz. But you can also, for updates and sneak peeks for the book, you can follow dataviz crit.
Okay, great. That's great. I will put all this and the links to everything that we talked about on the show notes so people can check it out, because there's a lot here and a lot for people to think about and hopefully do better, individuals and as teams. So this was great. Thank you so much for coming on the show, taking time out of your day. And I'll talk to you soon.
Okay. Thanks, John.
Thank you. And thanks everyone for tuning into this week's episode of the show. I hope you enjoyed that. I hope you'll start to think a little bit more in depth, a little bit more creatively, a little bit more with sophistication and purpose about your efforts in critiquing and receiving critique in your and others' data visualizations. Be sure to check out all the links on the show notes. I've got links to all these different checklists and frameworks that we talked about in the interview, and links to all the books that we talked about as well. There's some great new books out on the market, and I hope you'll check them out. And of course, don't forget to read the blog post that is up at policyviz.com, where you can sort of get my take on data viz critique. So until next time, this has been the PolicyViz podcast. Thanks so much for listening.